Morning, colleagues. I thought Fanie would at least break the ice, but it seems it's up to me. Welcome to all of you. There's a vibe in the room that suggests we've got the right people here. And moreover, that suggests that the topic is very timeless. And I've heard that from numerous people now saying that it's one of those topics that needed articulation. So I'm very, very delighted to welcome you on behalf of the Institute for Justice and Reconciliation. My name is Fanie de Toit, and I'm the Executive Director. I want to immediately acknowledge our partners in this. Marian will speak a little bit later, but we've been very fortunate to find these wonderful people in the Netherlands whom we're working with now quite closely and who will help us to think through this topic, and she'll speak a bit later, but thank you for this partnership. I also want to say that in a sense, what happened with this conference is that it grew out of our experience. We like to think, at least, that we operate in this special space called reflective practitioning. We also accept thinking or engaged thinkers, so that's okay. But to be in this space where you can reflect and be engaged at the same time. And coming to and fro in these areas where we work started evoking emotions in us as a staff at IJR. And we began a conversation about ourselves, in a way. The trauma that we felt we were vicariously suffering. That immediately and swiftly led to the conversation about then what about the people living there? And what does this mean? And so it's really an existential topic for us. It's come right out of the experiences that we've had in the field of peace building and of transitional justice. Now, if I'm simply going to raise 2 or 3 questions which I would love to listen out for in this period that we're together. But if we accept the 101 definition of trauma as the overwhelming of the coping mechanisms of an individual and the basic destruction of the belief that the world out there is a safe place, if that's our definition, and it may not be, but then I think political transition, well, war, oppression, political transition, all add layers of trauma on people. It's almost as if the water in the swimming pool raises by 1 inch, and those of us who had just had our noses above the water suddenly struggle to breathe. The society itself poses certain very serious challenges. So my first question is this one of how do we unpack and analyze the different forms of trauma, and can we link specific remedies to specific forms of trauma? So, for example, if you suffer direct violence, is there a different therapy, a different path that you walk with that person, as opposed to those who witnessed that violence, or who just lived in a society where there was structural violence aimed at them, in other words, systematic discrimination, the trauma of poverty, the trauma of deprivation, the trauma of exclusion, vis-à-vis those people who perhaps suffered cultural violence, which is the systematic degradation of human dignity in the pervasive frameworks of the time. Vis-à-vis those people who perhaps dare we speak about, for example, guilt as a form of trauma? Those people for whom the world ended when the transition began. And then what about the healers themselves, who themselves come away? And often I look at some of us who've been in the field for a while, and I think we may be more traumatized than some of the people we work with. So these are different layers, perhaps, of trauma. Do we link these different layers, structural violence, cultural violence, direct violence, political transition, change, to different remedies? Or do we somehow look at a more holistic approach? Sometimes when I engage officials of a new regime somewhere on this continent, You speak with them. It feels like when my son showed me a button on my cell phone the other day, that you press this button and then up comes all the apps that are running in the background. So then you can close all the apps down, so that the battery lasts longer. You look at somebody, an official, and you think, you get the sense there's so many applications running in the background in that person's head. So many things happening that's depleting his resources, that he has to cope with just to sit in that chair. That for him or her to be in charge of this extraordinarily complex task of rebuilding a society, which we've likened before to rebuilding a Boeing while it's in the air, it is impossible. So and often these people are people with blood on their hands. So they're traumatized in the fact that they maybe perpetrated violence, but also the guilt that comes with that. And now they're in a leader position in the new society. So, and on change, if you face political transition, of course, the big fallacy today in South African public discourse is that we paint reconciliation as a not so radical option. In fact, reconciliation, properly understood, in my view, is the most radical change that you could undergo, because you make peace with that person that defined your world and was the outsider, and it subverts everything you thought and believed before. That absolutely radical change is traumatic. And often what we replace the previous regime with is a very nascent, very fledgling dispensation loosely based on what we believe is human rights. But that human rights belief, and we spoke about that last night, often come at the cost of established systems of security which people have built up over centuries. I was in Ethiopia last week. A woman went through a divorce. First thing she did when she realized that the husband was cheating on her was to call her on her mother, who assembled the local women's association, who had a meeting, who gauged the severity of the case, decided that this is serious, then contacted the elders of the women's family. They met. The elders of the women's family then contacted the elders of the husband's family, and they met, and they then together produced a sanction on the young man without the woman having to lift a finger. All of this is happening for her. When the man did not come to the party, the Women's Association then instituted proceedings for a divorce, as well as legal sanction on this guy to pay back the money that he stole from his wife. But now, that's a system of support that doesn't sit very well with, because I thought of my own society and thought, if you go through divorce, you're on your own like this. So that system of support, and when we have, and Ethiopia's human rights record is not exactly something to write home about, but there's a system of support. So we end a world, we begin a new world, but it's like a vacuum people step in. And it's hugely traumatizing. So these layers of trauma. The second question I just want to ask about is the link between societal healing and individual healing. Often we hear forgiveness advocates, people who speak about forgiveness as the key, that lots of individual healed people will make up a healed society. So we must just get as many individuals healed as possible, and then there will be a society that will be healed. But more than that, they speak about society as kind of like a supra-individual. Society acts like an individual. So society can mourn, society can forget, society can forgive, society can do this and that, which are normally just individual functions. Is that correct? Does society actually function like an individual? Or the other side, the more liberal approach would be to say, we change society first, and then individuals will change within that society. So, and that's Societal change is modest. We're not aiming for high things, we're aiming for a bit of civic trust, maybe institutional reform, some prosecution of guilty parties. Then in that atmosphere, people will heal. Is that correct? So what is the link between individual healing and societal healing? And I'm rushing. And the third I just want to mention is the link between healing and morality. And I was just wondering about that this morning too. In a sense, the doctor who picks up the patient on the battlefield does not ask on which side the patient fought. They simply treat the patient in front of them. How do we hold onto a moral framework that says one side is right and the other is wrong? We're on the side of the right, and yet also have an approach that looks for healing of whoever crosses our path, even the vilest perpetrator. How do we hold these two frameworks next? How do they come together? This idea of healing and the idea of morality. Perhaps the ultimate morality is not to make a distinction. I don't know, but that is a question I will be looking out for. Because it gets blurred, gets very blurred. This week, the American Psychological Association had to defend its role in secretly coordinating with officials of the CIA and the White House an ethics policy on national security interrogations and torture. So what actually happens, the APA monitored the Bush administration's torture program, and in fact worked hand in glove with the Bush administration to work out a guidance policy for how much you can torture people, when you should stop, and so on. I mean, this is perhaps an extreme example, but it just shows that this line between morality and healing can blur very quickly and with dramatic effect. So the War Trauma Foundation has got huge amounts of experience in this, and I'd like to think IJR has got a little bit, but we've got so many knowledgeable people in this room to ponder some of these questions, and I'm sure many others as the time goes on. I mean, if I just look around the room, there are dozens of organizations represented here. So we thank you for coming. I want to thank Fanie for convening this, for being the driving force, and for having the original idea, and for making it happen, Fanie. Fanie says it was very easy, in fact. It's like, it was the time for this was right, but I know that that's perhaps an understatement. So, Fanie, thank you for that. Thank you also for Anthea Flink, who was behind most of the logistics. And I look forward to very fruitful deliberations with all of you over the next few days. Thank you very much.
Good morning, everybody. It's a bit high, isn't it? On behalf of our Trauma Foundation, I would like to welcome you to this conference as well. And let me start also thanking you all for being here. When starting to prepare the program in February, I was afraid that no one would come, because we had only 2.5 months before the conference. And I thought, this is really idiot, and that the agendas of you all would be filled totally. But here we are. Frédéric and I am so pleasantly surprised that you all, by your enthusiasm and participation. And I think that it shows how important it is to address issues related to peace building and collective social transformation, with attention to individual and collective healing. We are here with about 52 persons from, I think, 15 countries and 16 organizations. About half of you are working in the field of mental health and psychosocial support, and the others are involved in peace-building activities. And some of you are experts working for a long time on the edge of mental health, psychosocial support and peace-building. And others are working in the specific fields and are confronted with the dynamics in a society that go beyond their field of programs. It was our intention to keep this conference small, so that everyone can participate in the discussions, And we hope that sharing and discussing case studies, teams will result in a critical interaction between academics, researchers, practitioners and policymakers. And we also hope that we will identify areas that require further research and understanding, and that we will find opportunities for collaboration and come to activities related to peace building and collective social transformation in community-based psychosocial projects and in areas that have been affected by collective violence. We all know that war and conflict fragment societies and weaken the social fabric that governs relationships and the capacity for recovery. In the aftermath, the causes of conflict might still exist and may even have worsened as a result of the violence during the conflict. A return of the conflict is often very likely to occur in post-conflict countries, where people have witnessed and experienced large-scale violence, destruction, displacement and personal loss. And the ability of individuals and societies to cope with such extraordinary painful experiences is limited, and the breakdown of coping strategies often triggers psychosocial trauma. The natural ties, rules and bonds between people within communities and that strengthen coping and resilience are destroyed. Restoring the social fabric that binds and supports people within their own community is essential for those who've gone through serious traumatic experiences. These themes come together exactly at the core of this conference. Therefore, what I would like to address firstly is the importance of linking mental health care and psychosocial support, and secondly, the importance of linking mental health and psychosocial support in the processes of peace building and social transformation. As War Trauma Foundation, we are convinced that when working in a very complex conflict or post-conflict society, it is not enough if we work in the field of mental health and psychosocial support in isolation. We think that greater attention should be given to the synergies that could be created by linking mental health and psychosocial work with processes of social change, communal recovery, within the context of collective violence and humanitarian emergencies. We are here to work further on the steps already taken to engage mental health and psychosocial support with peace building. The field of mental health and psychosocial support in post-conflict settings is not only care for traumatized individuals and service delivery for direct victims or individual trauma therapy for people who suffer from post-traumatic stress disorder. The field of mental health and psychosocial support has developed rapidly over the past 2 decades from a widely diverse set of fragmented community approaches, including sharing problems, community dialogue, traditional healing rituals, art projects, theater initiatives, and so on. And these types of interventions are referred under the umbrella category psychosocial interventions. And the publications of the guidelines of the mental health and psychosocial support in emergency settings by the Interagency Standing Committee, developed and endorsed by more than 40 organizations, and in which Mike Wessels has had a major role, was an enormous step forward in unifying a rather fragmented field. I know that Mike will tell us more about this. A clear conscience that has developed is that mental health and psychosocial support activities in post-conflict settings should not only focus on assisting individuals and families with problems, but should include interventions to strengthen the resilience and coping of the individuals, families and communities, and societies at large, and to promote overall well-being of individuals and communities. This is also one of the missions of War Trauma Foundation, to go from the individual trauma to the collective trauma, and to give great attention to the synergies that could be created by linking mental health and psychosocial support with processes of social change and family and community recovery within the context of collective violence and rehabilitation. This approach generally shares the view that armed conflict is not only impacts the mind of an individual, but also the dynamic in families and in a community. Given that conflicts tend to affect people's mental health, and that high levels of poor mental health affect the ability of individuals, communities and societies to function peacefully and effectively during and after conflict, post-conflict justice and reconciliation mechanisms must necessarily be integrated with mental health and psychosocial support structures. But doing this in reality is not easy, and I would give you 2 examples from our work in World Trauma Foundation. One example is a project in North and South Kivu. We are asked by the international NGO which supports schools in that area to support the teachers and children because they were, according to that international NGO, too traumatized to teach and the children too traumatized to learn. As internal displaced peoples, in a very unsafe environment, they are living in a really terrible situation. And we are training the teachers on how to support children while living in a war situation, on staff care, on recognizing children with severe mental health problems and how to support them and when to refer them. We started programs for children how to cope with the ongoing cruelties and to cope with the permanent fear and to address their worries and problems. We are convinced that we should do this, but at the same time, the challenge is how to prevent to become a single issue organization. Although working on an ecological perspective, there's to be holistic. We cannot do everything, such as food security, livelihood for the parents, or micro-enterprise development. But we did not succeed in getting other organizations involved. What can we do in such situation? What models or collaborations are effective? Or can we develop an agenda that is also determined by the beneficiaries themselves? And should the training of the teachers not explicitly incorporate reconciliation? How to do this in a context in which the fighting and atrocities are still going on and the violence and killings have become normalized? Another example is our project which we have with the Ahmed University of Women in Khartoum in Sudan. The focus in that program is enhancing mental health and psychosocial support capacity in education, teaching and human aid organizations. It's a good program because the embedding in the university and engaged local organizations is very strong. At the same time, we know that the real beneficiaries are the hundreds of thousands internally displaced people and refugees in Sudan, and that the violence and human rights and human dignity are continuing. The violation of human rights and human dignity are continuing and will have long-lasting effects. We are not addressing that, and that is also not possibly politically spoken. However, it caused fragmentation between the social, the political and psychological reality. After I've given you these 2 examples, I repeat the question. What kind of support should be provided or facilitated to people affected by war and violence? And how should different types of support be prioritized or combined? And if you cannot offer a program that not only pays attention to mental health and psychosocial support for the recovery of individuals, families and communities, together with interventions focusing on reconstruction and re-establishment of governments, public services and institutes, is it still good to offer only part of it? Is it helpful or maybe sometimes harmful? As a mental health and psychosocial organization, as World Trauma Foundation is, we have developed in-depth knowledge in specific fields, and it is extremely difficult to interrelate in our programs with the social structure and the political nature of a society, and address how these interrelationships play out in the lives of the individuals and in the communities. At the same time, we assume that when we direct psychological interventions are undertaken, even individual approaches such as counseling, the individual might be in a better place to improve his or her life changes by being healthy enough to engage in a community and in social life. and in the workplace, and arguably even wider processes such as peace building. The question becomes how certain psychological interventions can shape and are shaped by wider social change, in particular processes of peace building and vice versa. Many questions, and I hope I will come closer to answers. It might require a conceptual shift that goes beyond the current practices. I don't know. Okay, before I stop, I only want to say something else. As some of you know, I'm also editor-in-chief of Intervention, a journal of mental health and psychosocial support in conflict-affected areas. And last year we had a special section on peace building and psychosocial work. You've all seen copies of it on your table. We have taken it with us. So the section was edited by our guest editor, Brennan Hammer, who's also here, Director of International Conflict Research Institute, one of our keynote speakers, and Elizabeth Gallagher, associated with INCOR, and Peter Ventevogel, my predecessor as Editor-in-Chief of Intervention. It's a special section. In the special section we link psychosocial intervention to peace building, as we do in this conference. It contains some very interesting contributions, and I hope that the journal Intervention can become a vehicle for transferring knowledge on the interconnectedness between mental health and psychosocial needs, practices and peace building, in order to help individuals and community to heal and to get peace in mind, and societies to transform in a peaceful society. We very much welcome articles for you on this issue as well. So I'm sure we will have a very inspiring and fruitful conference. And I also hope that regardless of the topic, we also will enjoy it and have some fun. Thank you.